Psychology wasn't always the science we think of today. For centuries, it was really just the stuff of armchair philosophy. So, how in the world did we go from people just debating the nature of the soul to controlled, repeatable experiments in a laboratory? Well, the answer really comes down to one person who had a truly radical idea. A man named Wilhelm Wundt, who decided it was finally time to actually measure the mind.
Okay, so to really get what Wundt did, we're going to take a little journey. First, we need to understand the huge problem he was up against, what the world of psychology looked like before him. Then, we'll dive into his revolutionary solution, see how he brilliantly connected it to the physical brain, and finally, we'll unpack why his ideas are still so incredibly important today.
All right, so let's set the stage. Back in the 19th century, the study of the mind was, well, it was stuck. Big time. There was this massive fundamental problem that it seemed like nobody could solve.
I mean, really think about this for a second. How do you scientifically measure a feeling? How do you put a number on a thought? It's all internal, right? It's subjective. It changes from one moment to the next. For the hard sciences of the day, this was like an impossible wall to climb. It really looked like psychology was just doomed to be philosophy forever.
And this wasn't just a minor issue. The big-shot philosopher Immanuel Kant basically laid out the whole problem. He argued that you can't apply mathematics to mental events because they don't exist in space, only in time. And, get this, you couldn't experiment on them because the very act of observing your own thoughts changes the thoughts you're trying to observe. For a lot of people, Kant's argument was pretty much the final word on the matter.
The main idea floating around at the time was this thing called faculty psychology. They basically thought of the mind like a toolbox, filled with these separate powers they called faculties, like reason, memory, and will. So if you were great at remembering things, they'd say it's because you have a strong memory faculty. Wundt just saw right through this. He said, hold on, that's not an explanation, that's just a label. It's a totally circular argument. It's like saying a car moves because it has a moving faculty. It tells you absolutely nothing. And this is where Wilhelm Wundt steps onto the scene. He saw all these philosophical dead ends and basically said, I think I've got a way through. He proposed a radical new path to turn psychology into a real, legitimate science.
And listen, Wundt was not shy about his goals. Right there in the preface to his groundbreaking book, he came right out and said it. He was attempting to mark out a new domain of science. I mean, talk about a bold statement. This wasn't just another book for him. It was a full-on manifesto. He even admitted it wasn't perfect, but he was completely convinced this was the future for the study of the mind. He gave this new field a name, Physiological Psychology. Now, the core idea was simple, but it was absolutely revolutionary. He said, if you want to study the mind scientifically, you have to stop floating around in philosophical space. You have to study its physical home, the brain and the nervous system. The mind wasn't some ghost in the machine, it was tied directly to our biology. And that physical connection, that was the key to making it measurable.
So here's how he actually did it. The old way, right, was just pure introspection. You just kind of sit there and think about your own thoughts, which is notoriously unreliable. Wundt's method was completely different. You control the input and you measure the output. You present someone with a simple, controlled stimulus, like a flash of light or a specific sound, and then you time with incredible precision their reaction. And just like that, bam! An internal mental event was suddenly translated into an objective, measurable piece of data.
Okay, so here's a quick, funny little aside. The guy who brought all this clarity and precision to the method of psychology, he was famously, notoriously difficult to read. His own translator noted that Wundt's mind was moving so fast that he'd be, quote, thinking 2 or 3 things at once, often in the very same sentence. So a brilliant mind, for sure, but definitely not a simple one to follow on paper.
So this idea of connecting the mind to the body was a game changer. But an idea is just an idea, without evidence. Wundt knew he had to ground his new science in the actual physical reality of the brain and the nervous system as people understood it back then. So he did something really cool. He traced what he called the ascending complication of the nervous system, looking at it through this evolutionary lens. He started all the way down with the amoeba, arguing that its simple goal-directed behavior was like a primitive form of mind. Then he followed the story upwards to the hydra with its first specialized cells, then to invertebrates and their little nerve centers, and finally all the way up to the complex central nervous system in vertebrates, with the human brain right at the top. For Wundt, this was the smoking gun. The mind and its physical hardware evolved together.
Now, this whole evolutionary perspective leads to a really big question about how the brain actually works. Is it just a collection of specialized parts, kind of like different departments in an office, all neatly separated? Or is something else entirely going on in there? The popular and kind of wacky idea at the time was phrenology. You've probably seen the pictures, right? They thought the brain was a map of different organs for things like reverence or poetic talent, and you could supposedly tell how strong each was by feeling the bumps on someone's skull. Wundt just completely rejected the simplistic view. He argued that functions are not locked away in little boxes. Instead, his big idea was that the brain is a deeply interconnected network. A single function could involve multiple areas, and the brain's real power came from the connections between those areas.
So when you put it all together, his focus on the brain as a network, combined with his new experimental method, you get a whole new foundation for psychology. And it all boils down to a few core principles that honestly sound like they could have been written yesterday. This is the part that just blows my mind. Listen to how modern this sounds today. First, manifold representation, the idea that any single function is spread out across multiple parts of the brain. Second, ascending complexity, meaning simple processes combine in the brain to create more complex ones. Third, relative specialization, which says, yeah, different areas have special jobs, but they absolutely have to work together as a team. And finally, the most important one, connection is key. He argued the brain's real power isn't in its individual parts, but in the network of pathways connecting them. This is the bedrock for modern ideas like neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to adapt, to learn, and even to recover from injury.
So in the end, Wundt's ultimate legacy wasn't just making psychology a science. It was giving us a whole new way to think about ourselves. He shifted our focus away from isolated compartments and toward this dynamic, interconnected network. So here's the thought I want to leave you with. If our mind, our thoughts, our memories, our very sense of self isn't in any single place, but is the result of an ever-changing web of connections, what does that really mean for who we are?